This is Asian News Weekly, the podcast featuring news, commentary, and analysis from the Asia-Pacific region. South Korea stares down the MERS virus, trying to contain its spread. Updates from the Shangri-La Defense Conference, and China races to rescue those trapped aboard a sunken cruise ship. These stories and more are coming up next. Hello everyone, welcome to this very special Thursday edition of Asian News Weekly on June 4, 2015. My name is Steve Miller, your host, and while I did say I was going to take the week off, there's just so much going on and I have a few extra minutes, so I'm going to put this together just for you. So without further ado, let's get started. In 2009, South Korea had a knee-jerk reaction to the arrival of swine flu. It saw the country screening arriving passengers, warning against foreign travel, and classes canceled at public schools as well as private academies. Now, right after learning about the U.S. government sending live anthrax to one of its bases here, the nation finds itself once more dealing with a communicable disease, this time in the form of the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS. And we're seeing a very similar reactionary pattern. Classes once again have been canceled, companies have advised against traveling to the Middle East, and the nation's health ministry issued warnings urging the public not to touch camels or eat uncooked camel meat, begging the question, just where the hell do you find those things? Now, MERS is no joke. It is a viral respiratory illness caused by a coronavirus, the same family of viruses that causes the common cold. Now, MERS was first reported in Saudi Arabia in 2012. It spread out to other countries in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, Asia, and even the United States. Now, most cases outside of the Middle East were reported by people who had recently traveled there. South Korea and other nations are wisely taking precautionary measures, quarantining those who have come into contact with the initial South Korean patient in an effort to stop the disease's proliferation. There's even been the formation of task forces to ensure things don't get out of hand, because MERS primarily causes fever, cough, and shortness of breath, but other symptoms do include nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Treatment for MERS includes rest, fluids, pain relievers, and oxygen therapy in severe cases. The fatality rate for MERS is between 30 and 40%, and you're at greater risk if you're elderly, have diabetes, renal failure, chronic lung disease, or a compromised immune system. The incubation period for MERS is about 2 weeks following exposure. Now, just like the common cold, there is no cure or vaccine for MERS, but there are things you can do to reduce the likelihood of you catching it. You should vigorously wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. Cover your nose and mouth with a tissue when you cough or sneeze, and throw used tissues in the trash immediately, and then wash your hands carefully. Disinfect frequently touched surfaces such as doorknobs. Avoid touching your face, mouth, and nose with unwashed hands, and don't share cups, utensils, or other items with sick people. So just how did South Korea get into this pickle? Well, a 68-year-old man returned from the Middle East. Now, he was asymptomatic at the time, but started feeling ill about a week later. He went to a total of 4 healthcare facilities, creating multiple opportunities for exposure among healthcare workers and other patients, according to the WHO. MERS wasn't suspected, so he wasn't put into isolation and was allowed to freely move about. And that is how it spread. Now, this took place at the beginning of May. Since then, a 58-year-old woman who had contact with the very first patient died of acute respiratory failure on June 1st. In addition, a 71-year-old man who had been on respiratory support also died. These are the first 2 reported deaths attributed to MERS in South Korea, which I think helped spur the reactionary response that we saw here. Remember, they just had that anthrax being mailed to Osan Air Base. Authorities have confirmed at least 35 cases of MERS as of Thursday morning, with more than 1,300 people being quarantined. The cases seem to have spread because of that initial patient being allowed to travel in and out between the hospitals and freely among the facilities before being correctly diagnosed. Now, a hospital in Pyeongtaek, where 2/3 of the South Korean MERS cases have been identified, has been closed to all but a skeleton staff. The overriding fear is that MERS is going to mutate and then spread even quicker without the need for direct contact. The South Korean ministry has come under fire for not acting fast enough. Minister Moon Hyung-pyo said, "We apologize for causing concern and anxiety among people due to our initial judgment on the contagiousness of MERS." While some of the blame can be directed at the health ministry and the administration, in my opinion, they're just easy targets. Yes, they could have done more and handled things better, but it's also important to keep in mind that all those actions that help reduce the spread of MERS, especially covering one's mouth when coughing and washing one's hands, are simply activities not performed or practiced by many people in South Korea. So keep in mind, the bottom line, if you're healthy, cover your mouth when you cough and wash your hands frequently. The Mayo Clinic and the WHO say your risk of contracting MERS is relatively low if you follow common sense. Now, there has been a financial impact as well. Tourists from China and Taiwan are canceling tours, and we've already seen a dip in the Korean stock market. Now, this, of course, is a quickly developing story, and I'll be continuously tracking it. So please, if you want further up-to-date news, follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. The Shangri-La Defense Conference, which took place in Singapore last weekend, covered a lot that's been regularly discussed here on this Asian News Weekly podcast. But here are a few important highlights. U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter delivered a keynote address in which he really drove home the U.S. position on what's taking place in the South China Sea, China's land reclamation efforts, and the United States' commitment to regional allies. Carter noted that disputes should be resolved peacefully through diplomacy, not aggression or intimidation. All countries have the right to freedom of navigation and overflight so global commerce can continue unimpeded. These are the rights of all nations. They are not abstractions, and nor are they subject to the whims of any one country. They are not privileges to be granted or withdrawn by any country. He also said we must strengthen regional institutions. The nations of ASEAN have laid the foundation for the architecture in Southeast Asia that we enjoy today, and ASEAN will continue to be central to it. Carter noted that the United States would further its ties and form partnerships with allies to promote peace and ensure maritime security. Opening the conference, Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong called on China and ASEAN members to break the vicious cycle by adhering to international law and concluding a code of conduct on the South China Sea. If a physical clash occurs, which escalates into a wider tension or conflict, either by design or more likely by accident, that would be very bad, said the Prime Minister. He also went on to say, but even if we avoid a physical clash, if the outcome is determined on the basis of might is right, that will set a very bad precedent. In fact, Malaysia's Minister of Defense warned that a South China Sea conflict could become one of the deadliest conflicts the world has ever seen. A lot of the discussions were aimed squarely at China, and as you might expect, they fired back. China defended its South China Sea land reclamation projects, saying the United States was making absurd remarks about China's long-established sovereignty and rights, stirring up trouble and slinging accusations regarding China's appropriate and rational construction activities on its islands. China even went on to say that the United States' view on the matter was incomplete and lacked jurisprudence. Look, this is the same nonsense that's been taking place for the past few years. On the diplomatic front, nothing is really being settled, aside from the United States forming alliances with Japan, Australia, and ASEAN members. What we have here are two distinct and opposing views on how the region should be parsed. With that dichotomy, while no one wants to really admit it, we have entered into a new Cold War, and that Cold War is defined as such: a state of political hostility between countries characterized by threats, propaganda, and other measures short of open warfare. You see, that's where we are. The only major difference between this Cold War and the one we saw in the 1980s is the amount of money tied up in trade vital to all parties in the South China Sea. While it is vital for cooler heads to prevail, the question now becomes how to get the sides to even agree that there is a dispute and how to resolve it before it's too late. Monday evening, a cruise ship sank in China's Yangtze River following a storm in the area. Some 450 plus were on board when disaster struck. Rescue efforts were initially complicated by bad weather in the area, according to local reports, but a dozen passengers were rescued and 5 bodies recovered. On Tuesday, rescue workers were said to have heard sounds from inside the capsized vessel, believing passengers were still alive inside the submerged cabins. By Wednesday, 2 more passengers had been rescued, bringing the total to 14, while the recovered bodies climbed to 26 from the ill-fated Eastern Star. The Xinhua news agency said the disaster could become the deadliest in the country in almost 7 decades, as rescue workers started cutting a small hole in the bottom of the ship in an attempt to free anyone still alive inside. The ship sank in a very short time frame, so there could still be air trapped in the hull, Li Chi-shui of the Naval University of Engineering said, indicating there could still be survivors. The free flow of information to the public hasn't been as forthcoming as some would like. Family of those believed to be on board clashed with police over the lack of information. The police first formed a human wall and didn't let us in. Then the relatives got excited and started to shout. Some policemen hit people, a young woman said, whose mother was on the boat. The fact that authorities aren't sharing a lot of information shouldn't come as a surprise, as China strictly controls the media. Plus, there are a lot of similarities between this disaster and South Korea's Sewol ferry from a year ago. The captain and chief engineer are among the survivors and have also been placed into police custody. Many of the passengers on both vessels were of advanced age, and modifications were also made to the Eastern Star. Seeing how things were so poorly handled by Seoul, it's no wonder why we're seeing things handled differently by Beijing. In fact, the Chinese Prime Minister Li Keqiang arrived Tuesday morning, even discussing the situation en route on his airplane with those on the ground Monday. Now, given the length of time that has passed since the vessel sank and where we are today on Thursday, it is important to hope for the best, but in all reality, we should expect some grim news. I am a desert rat, meaning I love the heat. In fact, summer is my favorite time of year. But my heart goes out to those who have been affected by the heat wave in India. More than 2,200 people have died as the nation suffered from extreme temperatures in the mid-40 degrees centigrade range, which is about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, cooling monsoon rains have started, but for many families, it's simply too late. Now, while the temperatures may not seem all that extreme, especially since I come from a part of the United States where we see even higher temperatures than that, the important thing to keep in mind is that while we have all this technology, aircon, shade, fans, electricity, stable elements that make our lives very easy, many of those affected by this heat wave in India simply don't have those amenities. All right, my friends, this has been a quick podcast, but before we wind things down, let's take a quick look at some of your comments. First up, Stephen Levy from the Korea Underground podcast had this to say about why more South Koreans aren't raising concerns over the direction their government is going. Even if South Koreans were, it's very hard to get people motivated enough to actually do something about it. Park Geun-hye's administration has been a straight-up disaster on so many levels, and most of the Koreans I've talked to have just been like, meh, what can you do? And the political left here is in shambles. Too many old people calcifying the system, and not enough young people willing to look up from their government-monitored cell phones to force through some true progressive policies. Red White Dude had this to say on South Korea going Big Brother as well. Actually, the Big Brother thing in Korea will backfire. If a teenager was facing issues like pregnancy, bullying, suicide, etc., they may not be willing to open up, since those are delicate subjects. This will make them hide more, which is the exact opposite of what you want them to do. Anthony Bowman, on the U.S. pivot towards the South China Sea, had this to say, "Finally, it has taken the USA long enough. It might be too late to avoid confrontation." Lily Bruce left a rather voluminous reply in support of China's activities in the South China Sea. Here's just a portion. "It is the South China Sea. It is not the USA Sea. American, you go. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and others have carried out aggression against China in the South China Sea islands and reefs and construction of military facilities and garrisons. Vietnam and Philippines occupy more than 30 islands of China and have illegally exploited for decades. China has undeniable sovereignty over the South China Sea." Now, as I said, there's a whole lot more to that, but one assertion Lily Bruce made in the comment was that because the United States calls the area the South China Sea, it means they acknowledge it belongs to China. No, that is not the case. It's only the name of the sea. Travis Stimson says, "Maybe it's a blurred perception because of where I am, but it seems like after America lost its taste of continuous war, not responding to Syria, the cue was taken by other world powers that it's the time to make moves. Russia moving on Ukraine, China trying to reach out into the water. Not that America should be the world police, but there are no check and balances, just strategy and spin doctors. And the battles between the world powers are fought more on the stock market and hacking information rather than physical threats. Those are saved to use against weaker targets." And A.J. Preston wrote in response to an article I shared about South Korean Christian groups attempting to block a gay pride organization from getting permits they needed to hold an event. "Korea is not a theocracy. Christian groups are abusing the application system and hence constitutional right of free expression in Korea. Their God is all-loving. Most so-called Christians here in Korea are bigoted cultists, pure and simple." Once again, everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to leave a comment, and I hope you'll do so this week, not only on this podcast, but any of the articles I share. So be sure to connect with me via Facebook, via Twitter, or even in the comment section. My friends, if you enjoyed this week's podcast, please share it with your friends. And if you haven't, subscribe. It's quick and easy to do, but best of all, it's free. You can do it on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, on YouTube, or in your favorite podcast application. And when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. Now, if you have a question, a comment, or even some feedback about the show, send me an email message. That address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Now, if you'd like to hear more news from the region, be sure to follow Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And unfortunately, that's all the time I have. My name is Steve Miller. Thank you so much for joining me. And until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.